In this lecture, we are going to discuss vendor management, and we will start by discussing the circumstances under which we would share personal information with the vendor. We will then discuss contracts and contract considerations. We will talk about how to deal with the end of a contract, and we will conclude with a discussion on the facta, disposal rule, and vetting vendors. Under what circumstances would we share PII with a vendor? And we've come across a few of these examples before. One example is processing. And this is under a situation where we're asking a vendor to process data for us, perhaps our data or the data of a client. And the example I've given before has been accounting, shipping, human resources, and data analytics. We might also share data with the vendor if we are selling them data. And this is the case where the vendor is purchasing the data from us or from a client. It is common to see in this situation data brokers and advertising companies. With regards to contracts, it's important to understand that businesses are responsible for their vendors' actions, and also that vendors are covered by businesses' privacy policy. And so, as we'll see in a minute, when it comes to vetting vendors, it's really important that they understand what our expectations are and that they are contractually obligated to carry out those responsibilities. A few considerations with regards to vendor contracts. Confidentiality. If we're sharing data with a vendor, they need to keep that information confidential. No further use. They're using that data specifically for the purposes that we tell them to. If the vendor is using a subcontractor, then all of the expectations we have for the vendor flow down to the subcontractor. It's important that there are breach notification safeguards in place, as well as security safeguards. When it comes to the end of a contract, we need to discuss with vendors how data will be disposed of. And when it comes to disposing of data, we usually think of two forms of data: electronic data and paper data. When it comes to electronic data, we're often concerned with the data that resides on hard drives. And a few different ways that we can destroy electronic data includes deleting, formatting, and overwriting. These are the least safe. And in a lot of situations, when you delete or format or overwrite data, that original data is still accessible. And so in most cases, deleting, formatting, and overwriting are insufficient. Instead, we would want to sanitize or purge that media, the electronic media, or if it's magnetic, we would degauss it. And if you're not sure what degaussing is, you can go onto YouTube, put in the word degauss hard drive, and I'm sure you can find a short video there where you can see how that's done. Essentially, you're exposing magnetic media to magnetism, and that scrambles the data. And as a final resort, or depending on the sensitivity of the data, you may take that hard drive or whatever that electronic media is, and you would shred it, you would burn it, you would melt it, and then of course it's completely inaccessible. With regards to paper media, you would either shred or burn it. And I put vendor down here because, yes, you can contract out the disposal or destruction of data. In this case, of course, you want to make sure that you've done your due diligence, that the vendor understands what the expectations and responsibilities are, and that they follow through with those expectations. For the CIPP US, you need to know about the facta data disposal rule. And in short, this is a data disposal standard. Let's first talk about what facta stands for. FACTA, facta, stands for Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act. And we will see this in Domain 2 when we're talking about the different laws that apply to financial institutions. The facta data disposal rule has specific requirements for financial institutions, and these requirements set a good baseline for general disposition. The rule itself states that consumer reports must be disposed of in a way that prevents unauthorized access or misuse of data. Again, we haven't talked about consumer reports or consumer reporting agencies. We haven't even gotten to financial institutions yet, so we will actually review the facta data disposal rule in domain tool when we get to talking about the FCRA and facta itself. For now, the most important thing for you to know is just that there is a data disposal rule, and you're going to need to remember this within the context of data disposal. The rule requires that data disposal practices must be reasonable with consideration of data's sensitivity, costs, benefits, and technology. And so, for example, if you're looking at destroying electronic media, such as a hard drive, and let's say that that hard drive contains only a list of first and last names, or only a list of website visitors, or only a list of dates of birth with no first last name or no other identifying information, that's going to be low sensitivity data, and therefore what would be reasonable to low sensitivity data would not be reasonable for high sensitivity data. If you have a hard drive that has financial account information, that has social security numbers, that has protected health information, then the disposal of that data, the standards to which you will hold the disposal of that data are going to be much higher than that for low sensitivity data. It is important that when we're working with vendors, whether it's someone who's going to be processing data for us or it's someone who's going to be disposing of data for us, that we do our due diligence, that we vet them. Things that you need to consider are the vendor's reputation, news reports. You're going to want to get references and follow up with those references. You want to know what the financial condition of the vendor is. Are they about to go bankrupt, or have they been around for 10 years and they're in a very strong financial position? Does the vendor have insurance? You may even specifically be interested in whether or not they have cyber insurance. If there's a breach, are they going to be covered? Are they going to go out of business? Does the vendor implement the appropriate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards? When you are transferring data back and forth between your organization and the vendor, what is that point of transfer? How will data be transferred between the two organizations? Of course, that's going to be data in transit. You want to make sure that that data is protected in transit. And you want to make sure that whatever environment is going to be accepting that data is going to be pre-protected, that the access authorizations are already in place. You also want to make sure that vendor employees have received the appropriate training and awareness. They know how to handle the data that they're going to be working with, how to process it. You want to make sure that the vendor has an incident response program plan in place. And in some cases, your organization may even have the right to audit the vendor. If they say that they're taking XYZ precautions, you should have the right to audit at a moment's notice to make sure that those processes are in place and functioning appropriately. In this lecture, we discussed the circumstances under which an organization would share personal information, personal data with the vendor. Those are typically when the vendor is processing data for the organization or there is a sale of data. With regards to contracts, it's important to understand that businesses are responsible for their vendors' actions. And so contracts should be in place and vendors should be covered by the business's privacy policy. When sharing personal data with vendors, considerations include confidentiality, no further use, that subcontractors are held to the same standards as contractors or vendors, breach notification and security safeguards. When it comes to the end of a contract, organizations need to consider how personal data will be disposed. We looked at the different disposal options that are available for electronic and paper media. And we also mentioned that there are even vendors that specialize in data disposal. We briefly went over the facta disposal rule. In short, the facta disposal rule is a standard or baseline for disposal, and it centers on reasonable practices to prevent unauthorized access or misuse of data. And finally, when it comes to vendor vetting, your organization needs to do due diligence research, check the financial condition of the vendor, whether or not they have the appropriate insurance coverage. We want to make sure that vendors have the appropriate security safeguards in place. We want to check the point of transfer. We want to make sure that vendors' employees have received the correct training and awareness. And we want to make sure that vendors have an appropriate incident response plan in place and that your organization perhaps has the right to audit the vendor.